I welcome everyone, and I thank you so much for joining this particular program. And our beloved professor, Dr. M. Anandakrishnan, and it is quite unfortunate we lost him. It's a great loss for the entire society, as well as the family and all the friends and everything. So, for the people who never knew about Dr. M. Anandakrishnan, first I would like to give a brief intro. Then I'll hand over to Mr. Satyan to just give a memorial lecture. So Dr. M. Anandakrishnan was born on July 12, 1928, born in body, and he is married to Srimati Jayalakshmi Anandakrishnan and has four sons, Ramu Anna and Ravi Anna, Satyan Anna, and Shri Anna. And basically, Professor passed in College of Sin in Guindy in 1952. Then MS in 1956 from University of Minnesota. And there was the first civil engineering passed on in India in 1960 is IIT Kharagpur Civil Engineering. The same time, Professor has completed Ph.D. in 1960 from University of Minnesota, and is one of the first Ph.D. in India at that point of time. He's also one of the first Ph.D. in civil engineering in the University of Minnesota. So professional experiences, and I think his detailed resume goes to multiple pages. But I would like to highlight, based on my association with Professor and his contributions to education is immense, and we cannot measure it in basically in a different scale. And you name any committee at his peak time in his career, almost he was participating at any point of time 50 to 60 committees in Delhi on various positions with various contributions. Especially the committee to name it is Professor Tandon Committee, which Professor has immensely played an important role to evaluating 124 deemed universities and 44 deemed universities basically, and that committee matter is still pending with the Supreme Court. And there are enormous contributions, and in terms of education, his contributions towards and especially into College of Sin in Guindy, and he started the Alumni Center, and he completely reformed the entire the management of institutions, especially the Anna University. And in addition to that, he has just the Alumni Club, which is an important contribution for the alumni and all over the world. That has been basically started by the Professor M. Anandakrishnan. And similarly, the Alumni Center inside the campus. And that is also basically his contribution. That is all quite a main view. And in addition to that, and he brought a lot of funding from Germany. At that point of time, he has a very close relationship with the Anna University, AUFRG centers, and all other collaborations and everything. And similarly, in Tamil computing, if you take INFIT, that is an organization which he founded, and still now the INFIT is and completely reformed the Tamil computing in Inayathila Tamil எப்படி கொண்டு போறாங்கிறது வந்து Professor contribution is unbelievable. And especially in addition to that, he was working with Transparency International. That contribution is also very important because he brought immense role to the transparency. And his UN contributions are also it's very high, and basically it's due to that the Brazil government has given the Order of the Merit, which is one of the immense, very prestigious award. What the Professor used to say that we got it, and similarly the Padma Shri was awarded in 2002. And in addition to that, he founded the Tamil Nadu Foundation, played an important role for that. NRIs in US who contribute to India. And similarly, for Tamil Nadu Academic Sciences, similarly, he is associated with the DMK government, with the Dr. Kalangan and everything. And a lot of reforms has been started in e-governance, especially the birth certificate, everything, including the origin of the tidal park, which is a very prestigious IT first step in this country. And similarly, in the e-Pathasala content development, that is also probably playing an important role. And TechUp funding also. From the World Bank nominee, he was working for the TechUp funding for the reform of the technical education quality improvement program across the country. And he was an instrumental for establishing a science city inside the Birla Planetarium. and he was during the chairman of MIDS. The contribution is also very good, and he was heading the committee called bringing a Besu. That is when Mr. Pranavananda was a president. At that point of time, he constituted a committee, and Professor was the chairman for that. And he brought this IIST, Indian Institute of Engineering and Science and Technology, which basically earlier was called Besu, has been transformed to this one. And coming to education, always the professor was very close to the education, especially for the children. And he established a school in IIT Kanpur. And similarly, when he came to Anna University, also he established a school, an Anna Gen School, with a public-private partnership model. And there are a lot of credentials. There was a lot, and it runs into multiple pages. But he was very humble and very simple, and he always willing to help a lot of people and innumerous people. And any functions, anything, and he voluntarily goes and help the youngsters and bring some sort of a little bit hope for their life and everything. So I welcome everyone, and on a video about the professor's achievements. There just a very few that I would like to give it for the other audiences, and just then we'll take it forward with the lecture from Mr. Satyan Anna first, then followed by Mr. Shri Anna. And I thank you everyone for participating in this one. I'll start a small, I'll play a small video, then we'll get into the lecture. So thank you so much for watching this particular one. And my association starts with Professor from 2005, and it's an immense experience. And he had like a father and like a mentor. He helped me a lot. And with this, I'll hand over to Mr. Satyan Anna and brief introduction about Mr. Satyan Anna. Mr. Satyan Anna completed Mr. Satyamurthy Anandakrishnan school name and received BTech from Aeronautical Engineering from IIT Madras in 1981, then MSc in Aerospace and Oceans Engineering from BA Tech, Blackbird. During his first job at Naval Surface Warfare Center in Maryland, he co-authored with the AIAA textbook on re-entry of flight mechanics, also obtained MS from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. He then worked with the Hubble telescope and then the James Webb Space Telescope before retiring in 2018. Now his hobby is now getting a private pilot license. So over to Satyan, Anna, and they're just taking over the entire session, Anna. Thank you.
Prof.M. Anandakrishnan Memorial Lecture. My name is Satyamurthy Anandakrishnan. I'm Dr. Anandakrishnan's third son. And I'm going to be talking about the James Webb Space Telescope, essentially concentrating on how the design was done for the telescope. Over here shows the sun shield of the telescope. It's about the size of a tennis court, and you can see a lot of people standing next to it in the clean room. It gives you an idea of the size of the sun shield. I'll get into a lot more detail. On the bottom left over here is the primary mirror and the optical telescope assembly. It's being hoisted before it's mated to the sun shield. You can see there are 18 segments of mirrors that together make up the primary mirror. On the right over here, you can see the primary mirror has been mated with the rest of the telescope. You can see the sun shield. You will notice over here that the mirror has been folded and is slightly different from the configuration over here. Launch rocket has a fairing that covers it, and so the telescope needs to be folded up so that it will fit into the rocket. Okay, this is essentially an artist's impression of what the telescope will look like once it's in orbit. So here you have the 18 segments of the mirror. So when you're observing some object that's out in the far distance on the right, the light will come from that. It will hit this mirror here, reflect off the mirror. You have a secondary mirror over here that will focus the light in through this gap in this little black housing, where there is a third mirror, and that will distribute the light to the various instruments and cameras that are mounted in the back of this mirror over here. So this is essentially the telescope, the optical assembly, and the instruments, which is the payload, which makes up the payload of the James Webb Space Telescope. I'll be talking about the fact that this telescope needs to be maintained at a very cold temperature, and that's why we have this huge sun shield that shades the telescope and the science instruments from the sun, the earth, and the moon, so that it can become very, very cold. On the hot side of the telescope, on the sun side of the sun shield, is the spacecraft bus. This is where you have the computer, the solar array, the power system, the communication system, the control system that controls the whole observatory. So I won't be talking too much in detail about the spacecraft bus, but this just gives you an idea of what the telescope looks like. So first I'm going to talk about the mission objectives. What is it that we want to see with the telescope? I'll also talk a little bit about how we came up with the mission, or how the mission objectives were derived. Next, I'll be talking about the requirements for the James Webb Space Telescope. Based on what we want to see with the telescope, what should be the size, the weight, the operating temperature, and so on of the telescope. So this process of taking higher level requirements on what we want to see with the telescope and flowing it down, deriving lower level requirements for the telescope, is known as systems engineering. So the students out there who are listening to this talk, you might want to consider systems engineering as a potential field that you pursue as you go to college and so on. When you get into working on very large projects, systems engineering is something that can make or break a program. If you don't have proper systems engineering, your program could lead to failure. So it's something that you may want to think about as a career option. Okay, so moving on to the next part of the talk today, I'll be showing you some animations of how this telescope is going to be launched and how it's going to be deployed. Like I said before, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to stop me or type in a message in the chat box and I'll try to address it. Okay, so first we want to define the mission objective. This is true not just for James Webb Space Telescope, but any project that you all take up. If you define what you want to do precisely, it will make the job of executing the mission much easier. Okay? So I'm going to talk about first how the James Webb Space Telescope mission objectives were defined. The process that's usually followed in the US is something called a decadal survey. So every decade, a committee of eminent scientists from organizations like the National Academy of Science, National Science Foundation, NASA, and Nobel laureates, they get together and try to decide what it is that they would like to do in the coming decade. But they don't do this in isolation. They get input from national and international universities, professors, think tanks, other governmental organizations, and research organizations, and the private industry to see what it is we should be trying to focus on for the next decade. Based on this input and based on their discussions, they come up with a recommendation for the government that they think this is the type of telescope that should be built with certain science capabilities based on the current technologies that are available. Not only that, they will be looking into the future decades and say, based on current technologies, we may not be able to build certain things, but if we spend some money and time now on certain technologies, developing certain technologies, then in the future, we can use those technologies for future telescopes. And they provide this recommendation to the government. Now, the government takes this input and makes a final decision, and that could be based on what other science projects, other people may want to fund. And there's only a limited amount of money. So they have to weigh the various proposals that have come to them and decide which one they're going to do. They also think in terms of what is their long-term national policies and goals, and does this recommendation fit in with those policies and goals. Finally, they also need to take into consideration what is the political climate. If there's a recession right now, then there may not be the political will to spend money on an astronomical telescope. Okay, they may prefer to spend money on coming up with a COVID vaccine or with programs that are related to national health. So these are the things that go into how a mission objective is defined and whether or not a mission actually takes off. So going back to 1971, that decadal survey decided that the US needed to build a large space telescope. Okay? And the idea of this telescope was that it would be placed in an orbit around the Earth, but above the clouds and atmosphere of the Earth. So the main mission objective of this large space telescope was to determine the age of the universe. So for those of you that may not be aware, there is the Big Bang theory that says that so many billion light years ago, the universe started from nothing, and there was a big bang, and then from that the universe expanded, and you got all these stars and galaxies and so on as an expansion process from that. And today, so many billion years later, you have the Milky Way galaxy, and Earth is a planet that's orbiting one of the suns in the Milky Way galaxy. So one of the objectives of this mission was to determine the age of the universe. How long ago did this Big Bang happen? Another objective of this mission was that this telescope should have at least a 15-year life, and this telescope should have the capability of being repaired and upgraded in orbit. So that was the genesis of the Hubble Space Telescope. It was launched by the Space Shuttle Discovery in 1990. It is the only it's the only telescope that's designed to be serviced in orbit. So it was launched in 1990 with a 15-year mission, but now, 31 years later, it is still in operation, and it has been upgraded 5 times on orbit servicing missions, where the space shuttle went up, and you can see here in this picture, there's a robotic arm coming out of the space shuttle, which is going to, in this case, actually deploy the Hubble Space Telescope after a servicing mission. So one of the main discoveries of the Hubble Space Telescope was that the age of the universe is about 13.8 billion years, plus or minus 10%. So plus or minus 130 million years. Okay? So for those of you that are not familiar with billions and millions, 13.8 billion years is 1,380 crore years. Okay? Unfortunately, I'm going to be speaking mainly in billions and millions, and I hope that's not too much of a problem for you all. So keep in mind this number 13.8 billion. Okay, so I'll talk very briefly about Hubble Space Telescope before I transition to James Webb Space Telescope. Now, this telescope is in a low Earth orbit. It's in an orbit around the Earth at an altitude of 600 kilometers. You can see this is a picture taken from the space shuttle after the Hubble was released after one of the servicing missions. You can see here in the background, this is the Earth. It's orbiting around the Earth. And back here, you can see the background. That is the deep space. That is deep space. The Hubble Space Telescope is in a low Earth orbit at about 600 kilometer altitude. The primary mirror of the Hubble Space Telescope is 2.4 meters. Okay? Here you have for reference a typical human being, and the telescope is almost twice the size of a typical human being. Well, not twice the size, about 1.5 times the size. A typical human is about 5 to 6 feet, so this is 8 feet. What the astronomers really wanted was a 3-meter mirror, but that was too expensive and carried a lot of technical risk with it. So what the government agreed to was to a 2.4 meter primary mirror. It had to be about 13.1 meters long because it had to fit in the bay of the space shuttle. And it couldn't be more than 2.45 meters wide, again, because it had to fit into the bay of the spaceship. And then finally, it had to be designed to observe in ultraviolet, visible, and infrared. One of the main reasons for that was the telescopes that are on the ground, they cannot see very well in ultraviolet because the Earth's atmosphere blocks out a lot of the ultraviolet light. Same thing with infrared. The Earth's atmosphere distorts and blocks out a lot of the infrared radiations from galaxies and stars that are out there. So because the Hubble Space Telescope is outside most of the Earth's atmosphere, it can see almost back to the Big Bang. The Big Bang, like I said in the previous chart, is at 13.8 billion years. And here, Hubble Space Telescope is able to observe stars and galaxies and objects from about almost 13 billion years ago. Okay, so now moving to 1991. Remember, the Hubble Space Telescope was launched in 1990, but the 1991 decadal survey was already thinking about what is the next generation space telescope we need to build. So the 1991 decadal survey decided that we want to look a little further back into time. Hubble Space Telescope is able to look back to about almost 13 billion years ago. And for the next generation, they wanted to extend that even further to 13.4 billion years ago. Okay? So on the right here is a cartoon of the Big Bang idea. Okay? So here on the left is the Big Bang, which happened, we now know, about 13.7, 13.8 billion years ago. And then from that explosion, you had some things that happened in the first 400 years that we haven't been able to see right now. It's a theory right now. And in the future years, we will want to look back to that to see what happened there. But about 400 million years after the Big Bang, you had the start of the formations of the first stars, and then soon after that, the first galaxies. Okay? And then about 800 million years after the Big Bang, the galaxies were starting to form, and you had clusters of galaxies and so on, and planets started forming. So Hubble is looking back to about 800 to 900 million years after the Big Bang. And JWST, James Webb Space Telescope, or the Next Generation Space Telescope, is trying to look at what happened when the initial stars and all were formed. In addition to that, this Next Generation Space Telescope wants to be able to look through interstellar dust. There's a lot of dust out there in space, okay? And the birth of stars, the star formation, is essentially a process of this dust that collects together, and the gravity of this collection coalesces and becomes stars, okay? And just as stars are born, stars are also dying at the same time. And when these stars die, they spew out a lot of dust and gases, and these dust and gases essentially travel large distances, and then they mix with other dust and gases, and new stars are born. Okay, so this is one of the major objectives of this Next Generation Space Telescope. There are a lot of other objectives, but one of the objectives is to look at planets that are formed around these stars, okay, planetary systems, and when these planets are formed, can and how is life how does it spring up from these planetary systems? Okay? So these are three of the many objectives of the next generation space telescope that I'll try to tie into the objectives of the James Webb Space Telescope, or the design of the James Webb Space Telescope. So based on these main objectives, the telescope needs to be very large, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means. It needs to be cold, and I'll talk about why it needs to be cold. And it needs to observe in the infrared spectrum. Okay? And I'll talk about that also in the next few charts. So this next generation space telescope was eventually renamed the James Webb Space Telescope in 2005. So I'll be using Webb Space Telescope, the Webb Telescope, JWST interchangeably for the same thing. Hopefully it's not too confusing. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about how the requirements for the James Webb Space Telescope were derived, and in terms of what is the size that it needs to be, weight, and so on. So now let me talk a little more about the requirements of the James Webb Space Telescope. Like I said, it needs to be large. What does that mean? What the astronomers really wanted was an 8-meter mirror so that it could collect a lot of light so that they could observe very dim objects. Okay? Now, based on the cost and the complexity, it was decided that the James Webb Space Telescope would have a 6.5-meter primary mirror. Okay? That compares to 2.5 meters for the Hubble Space Telescope. So over here you can see a figure of a typical person. The Hubble Space Telescope, like I said, is about 1.5 times larger than that, taller than that. And then the primary mirror for the James Webb Space Telescope is 6.5 meters, which is about 2.5 times larger than Hubble. Because we are trying to look further back in time, we are trying to look at fainter objects, we need a larger mirror to gather more light. Okay? So remember that the energy that's coming from any object decreases by the cube of the distance. Okay? So if you go a little further away, the energy that's coming to you is going to be reduced by the cube of the distance. Okay? So that's why you need a large mirror. The other benefit of the large mirror is that it allows you to resolve objects a little better. What does resolution mean? So if you have two objects, okay, if you see the two objects as two separate objects and not as one object, that means you can resolve it. Okay, so the resolving power is 4 times better for JWST than for Hubble, and this is in infrared. And so because the Hubble Space Telescope is 2.5 times larger than the Hubble Space Telescope, the Webb Telescope light collection area is almost 7 times that of Hubble. It's based on the area of the telescope. Okay, the size of the primary mirror is 2.5 times the Hubble, but the weight limitation is about half of what the Hubble Space Telescope. The Hubble Space Telescope is 12,500 kg, but the James Webb Space Telescope needs to be less than 6,500 kg. Now, the reason for that is, and you will see that a little later, is that the James Webb Space Telescope has to be placed much further away from Earth, so the rocket cannot place a much larger object than 6,000 kg. The other requirement is that it needs to be cold. the Hubble Space Telescope, the telescope part of it, the optics and the instruments, are at minus 233 degrees Celsius. So that's about 40 degrees above absolute zero. In contrast, the Hubble Space Telescope is at plus 30 degrees Celsius. So it's about room temperature. And finally, as I mentioned before, the Hubble Space Telescope is observing in the ultraviolet, visible, and infrared spectrum. So all the way from ultraviolet all the way to near infrared. The James Webb Space Telescope, on the other hand, is tuned for orange to mid-infrared. So it's really designed to observe in orange or near infrared all the way to mid-infrared. All right, so the question is, why infrared? Why not visible? Why not ultraviolet? So to understand that, we need to understand what's called Doppler shift and what's called redshift. Okay? So the Doppler effect is that if there is sound, let's say there's an object and it's putting out some sound waves. If this object is moving towards us, what you will hear is actually a higher frequency than the sound that's being put out by that object. Similarly, if it's moving away from us, it will sound as if it's putting out a lower frequency sound. That's known as the Doppler effect. So if you're standing on the street and there's a car that's passing by and it's blowing its horn, okay? This is what it will sound like as it comes towards you and then it moves away. So as it's coming towards you, it had a higher frequency, and as it started moving away, that frequency reduced. The horn is the same frequency throughout the whole time, but as it comes towards you, it appears to be a higher frequency as it's coming towards you, but as it moves away, it has a lower frequency. The same thing is happening with light. Okay, light is also a wave. It's an electromagnetic wave. So if you have a light of a certain frequency, if it's moving away from you, what you will see will be a lower frequency. So you will perceive it shifted towards infrared. If it's coming towards you, then you will perceive it more in the blue or the ultraviolet spectrum. The faster this object is moving, the more red shift it'll have if it's moving away from you, and the more blue shift it'll have if it's coming towards you. So according to the Big Bang Theory, the universe is expanding. Everything is moving away from everything else. Objects are moving away from each other. And the faster they're moving away, the higher the redshift is going to be. So if you want to look at something that's putting out visible light and it's moving away from you at a very, very high speed, then it's going to appear to you as if it's putting out infrared light. Okay? That's why we want to build a telescope that looks at infrared. We are interested in looking at objects that are putting out light way back in time. Okay, we are looking back billions of years ago. We are not looking at what it is now. We are looking back at what happened billions of years ago, and that light is really shifted well into the infrared region, and that's why this telescope needs to be tuned for near and mid-infrared observation. Okay, so anything you look at is you're really looking back in time. When you go back, and if you go outside and look at the moon today, you're really looking at it 1 second ago. The light that left moon a second ago is now coming to your eyes. Okay, what you look at, well, never look at the sun, but when you look at the sun, the light that left the sun left about 8 minutes ago. The best telescopes on the ground only look back about 6 billion years ago or 7 billion years ago. What we are trying to look at with the James Webb Space Telescope is about 13 or 13.5 billion years ago. The other thing James Webb is interested in is observing objects through dust clouds. Here we have a picture taken by the Hubble Space Telescope of the Laguna Nebula and its invisible light. And you can see the dust clouds that are there. If you look at the same object in infrared, suddenly you see there's millions and billions of additional light stars that are hidden by this dust cloud. That's another reason we want to be looking in infrared. We can look through the clouds at these stars that are forming in this dust cloud or in this nebula. We also want to look at planets being formed. Okay. Now the planets are much fainter than the stars that are going around them. Okay, and so if you want to observe planets, you need to block out the light from the sun, from the star, so that you can actually observe the planets that are around here. So this is an image that was taken of a star that's been blacked out with a mask. So you don't see the light from the star, but you see the light that's reflected off the planets that are orbiting this star. And by observing the light coming from these planets, you can tell whether what kind of gases are in the atmosphere of this planet, and that way you can tell, is there life or is there a possibility of life on these planets. Okay, so this is and so the planets are going to be much colder than the star itself. Just like Earth is much colder than the sun, these planets are going to be much colder. So you need to, if you want to observe something that's really cold, you need to observe in infrared, and your telescope needs to be very cold. So that is the reason that you want a very cold telescope, 40 Kelvin or minus 233 Celsius. And in order to do that, you have to have a telescope that is passively cooled. That's why you have this large sun shield that's blocking the heat and light that's coming from the sun, so that the telescope can radiate its heat away and it becomes cold. Just like objects that are on Earth at night, they cool down. Just like that, if you block the sunlight, the telescope cools down. So here you have sun coming from the sun and the earth and the moon, and that gets reflected away from the first layer from the sun shield, and then, but still a little bit gets through. The next layer reflects that away, and so on. So that on the sun side of the sun shield, the temperature can be as high as 125 Celsius, whereas on the cold side, the sun shield is down to 235, and the telescope is actually even colder than that at 233 Celsius. So here is another image or another drawing. Here you have the sunlight coming from the left side, and you have the sun shield blocking the light from the cold side, which is where the telescope and the instruments are. And these telescope and instrument is at minus 233 Celsius. The spacecraft, where you have the solar array, where you have the computer, where you have the thrusters, where you have the propellant, that's all at a much higher temperature. And you can see that you have 300 to 400 degrees Celsius difference within a very short distance. Okay? And so this tennis court size shield is protecting the telescope from the hot side of the telescope. Okay. Here are just artist conceptions of what it looks like in space. Sun is on the bottom over here. The spacecraft will be extremely hot relative to the telescope. The telescope is extremely cold. That spacecraft will be between room temperature and boiling water temperature. Okay, so where exactly is the telescope placed? Okay, here's the sun. Earth is 150 million kilometers from the sun. Looking a little closer at the Earth, this is the Earth. The Hubble Space Telescope orbits the Earth at about 600 kilometers, and the moon is about 300 to 400 kilometers from the Earth. James Webb Space Telescope is going to be placed 1.5 million kilometers from Earth. It's going to orbit a point called the Lagrange 2 point, the L2 point. So this is where this is where the telescope is going to be. And I'll show you a short animation to understand what this looks like. Okay, so what this animation shows is the sun over here. The Earth is orbiting the sun. You can barely make out the moon is orbiting the Earth. Okay, and this is the L2 location. And so the James Webb Space Telescope is going to orbit around the L2 position, which moves with the Earth around the sun. So essentially, James Webb is going to be orbiting this L2 position as the Earth moves around the sun. The James Webb Space Telescope is moving along with that around this L2. And if you look from L2, you can see that's where the Earth is. The moon is orbiting the Earth. The sun is over there. So I hope this gives you an idea of where the James Webb Space Telescope is in relation to the sun, the Earth, and the moon. Okay, I'm going to now jump to the launch video. Okay, so this is an animation of the launch and the deployment of the telescope. Okay, I'm going to pause the video here for a moment. You can see over here you have Earth, and this blue track shows the track that the rocket and the telescope is taking. Here you can see where the moon is in relation to Earth and where in relation to where the telescope is. Okay, here is actually where the telescope, so you can see the Earth over here. You can see the telescope attached to the second stage of the rocket here. I'll restart it in a minute and you'll see it a little better. And up here you can see the timeline. So it was 000 when it launched, and now we are starting to view this animation 3 minutes after launch. Okay, within 3 minutes the booster has fallen away, and only the second stage is attached to the telescope over here. Okay, so you can see the telescope, and it separates from the second stage at about 30 minutes after launch. A few minutes later, the solar array is deployed so that we can start powering up the telescope. And then we reorient the telescope so that the solar array is looking at the sun. Okay, so now we have jumped to 6 hours after launch, and we are going to do a thruster burn, so that we can get it into the right orbit. And so we have reoriented the telescope so that the thrusters point in the right direction, so that it moves the telescope in the right direction. So this is where the burn is happening. This is a small thruster on the back of the telescope that burns for a very few minutes. Okay, now we have jumped to 22 hours. And at this point, we are going to do a second burn of the thruster. And then we deploy the antenna so that it can point back to Earth so that we can communicate with Earth. You can see over here, the thrusters are burning again to get the right velocity so that it enters the right orbit. You can see here that mirrors are stored, the sun shield is stored. Okay, we have finished the burn, and now we have jumped to 3 days after the burn. Okay, so for 3 days it has been coasting, moving away from the Earth, moving towards the Lagrange L2 point that's over here on the right. Okay. Now we are getting ready to deploy the sun shield and so on. So we reorient it so that it's oriented in the direction we want. And now you can see the front sun shield palette is being deployed. Notice this is taking about an hour to deploy that. So when this is happening in real life, it's moving very, very, very slowly. It's taking a couple of hours for this sun shield palette to come from the top to the bottom. Now we reorient the telescope so that we can now deploy the rear sun shield. Now the rear sun shield is being deployed, and we have just moved beyond the Earth's orbit at this time. I mean, the moon's orbit around the Earth. Now we separate the telescope from the spacecraft bus. Now we are removing the covers from the telescope, from the sun shield, the front and the rear. And now the side booms over here are dragging the sun shield out. So you can see the sun shield is being dragged out as the side boom is deployed. You can see it better on this side. This side boom is being deployed, and it drags the 5 layers of the sun shield out. It tightens the sun shield, and then it separates the 5 layers of the sun shield. So you can see the 5 layers are being separated. Then there's a flap, a momentum flap on the back that gets deployed. Now we are getting ready to deploy the primary mirrors. On day 11, they first deploy the secondary mirror that was stored back there. Then it deploys the segments, the wing segments. First one side, and now the other side is being deployed. Now the primary mirror is complete. You have another thruster burn. So 1 month after it's launched, it finally reaches its L2 point, and then it'll enter an orbit. After that, it'll be orbiting the L2 point. So you have the sun on the left, and then you have the Earth, the moon, the L2 point, and the telescope is going to be orbiting the L2 point for the rest of the mission. And that, folks, is the end of my talk.